My name is Cosmos Darwin, and I lead the product management team for Azure Stack HCI at Microsoft. In this session, you'll get an overview of everything that's new for Azure Stack HCI in 2021. It's been a busy year for Edge infrastructure, and we have a lot of exciting new announcements this week. So I'm going to move quickly, but as always, you can find more information, including step-by-step instructions and demos, in the product documentation. Now, before we dive into what's new, I want to briefly touch on what Azure Stack HCI is. You're going to hear me talk a lot in this session about Azure workloads, Azure management, Azure infrastructure, and more. But in case you're not familiar, I do want to be very clear up front that Azure Stack HCI is edge infrastructure. It runs on premises. It runs on servers that you own, that you manage, and that you control on your premises. Now, besides that, I'm not going to really cover the basics today. I'm going to assume that you already know about Azure Stack HCI. But if you don't, I invite you to learn more. You can do that by visiting azure.com/HCI, and then come back to this session about what's new. And speaking of what's new, here is our agenda for today. Organizations around the world are choosing to run their business with services and tools from Microsoft Azure. And my team's mission with Azure Stack HCI and Azure Arc is to bring these services and tools to you so that you can innovate anywhere on your terms with hybrid infrastructure. That's why this year we've brought new workloads and benefits, new Azure management and governance capabilities, and new innovation from Azure's own infrastructure to Azure Stack HCI. This is what customers love about Azure. This is what you'll love about Azure Stack HCI, and it's what we're going to talk about today. We can start with Azure workloads and benefits. The most important part of Microsoft Azure, without a doubt, is the workloads that you run there. Whether it's a workload that started on-prem and you lift and shifted it to the cloud, or it's something new that you built natively in the cloud, Azure is all about your workloads. That's why today I'm delighted to share some of the ways that we're bringing your favorite workloads and the benefits associated with them from Azure to Azure Stack HCI. We should start with the most popular workload of all, and that's Windows Server. As an administrator, your experience deploying and managing Windows Server is better on Azure and Azure Stack HCI than it is anywhere else. And here are just a few of the reasons why. For new workloads, we have a special version of Windows Server 2022 that we call the Azure Edition. It's coming soon. This special version of Windows Server is designed specifically to run in Azure VMs only, meaning VMs on the Azure cloud or on Azure's edge infrastructure like Azure Stack HCI. And it comes with some unique benefits, some features that you really can't get anywhere else. My favorite is hot patching. You can literally update a Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition without restarting at all. That's just one example. There are lots of other features that your workloads will benefit from with the Azure Edition of Windows Server 2022. But we also know that not all workloads are on the latest version of Windows Server. In fact, far from it. There's a whole healthy distribution of versions out there. That's why for older workloads, we have free extended security updates available for Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2, Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, and the corresponding versions of Microsoft SQL Server. If you lift and shift one of these older instances of Windows or SQL onto the Azure cloud, you get free extended security updates so that you have a couple more years to modernize that workload. That benefit also applies on Azure Stack HCI. You get the same free extended security updates that you would in the Azure cloud, but now you can modernize that workload and keep it on premises. And regardless of which version of Windows you're running, Azure and Azure Stack HCI offer the most convenient options for licensing and activating your Windows workload. For a while now, we've had the ability to bring your own license key for Windows Server to Azure Stack HCI, but new this year, we're introducing a second option to pay for Windows Server on Azure Stack HCI, where you can pay for it through your Azure subscription as an add-on service fee. Now, these benefits I'm describing are not just some policy or some Microsoft support statement. The team has had to do real engineering work to enable these scenarios to work outside of the cloud. Let me take a minute now to explain how this works. In Azure Stack HCI, in the latest version of 21H2, there's a built-in Azure Platform Attestation feature that is natively in the operating system. On every node in your cluster, the HCI service obtains a certificate from Microsoft Azure's root certificate authority and securely stores it within the enclave on each host. Then, the HCI SVC exposes a secure REST endpoint that's accessible only to VMs that are running on the same Azure Stack HCI cluster. That endpoint can be reached by the VM, and specifically by the guest OS, the instance of Windows running in that VM, so that it can request attestation to check whether it is running on Azure or somewhere else. And when it requests attestation, the HCI SVC service signs the response using the Azure certificate to convince the VM that it's actually running on Azure. That way the VM can say, "Hi, is this Azure?" And it gets back the response that it expects, correctly signed, that yes, it is Azure, even though it's running on your premises on Azure Stack HCI. This is how the guest OS knows that capabilities such as extended security updates are available to it. You don't even have to manage any keys or anything manual like that. This is now built in to Azure Stack HCI. I also mentioned that you can now conveniently purchase Windows Server licenses for guest VMs on Azure Stack HCI through Azure. And I want to show you just a screenshot of that experience, which is rolling out now across all cloud regions. In the Azure portal, from an Azure Stack HCI resource, you can go to the configuration option on the left-hand side and simply purchase with one click a Windows Server subscription add-on. So if you already have a key, that's great. You can bring your key. That's not changing. But if you don't already have one, now it's easier than ever to get one. Okay, so far we've talked about Windows on servers. But just as important is Windows for desktops and laptops and client computers. And for the last few years, one of the most popular workloads to run in Azure, and one of the big reasons that customers choose the Azure cloud, has been the Azure Virtual Desktop Service, previously known as Windows Virtual Desktop. Today, I'm delighted to share that the Azure Virtual Desktop Service is coming for Azure Stack HCI. It's available in broad public preview this fall. With the Azure Virtual Desktop Service for Azure Stack HCI, you can extend the benefits that you love about cloud-managed VDI to your on-premises environment. The control plane for Azure Virtual Desktop continues to run in the public cloud, meaning it's fully managed by Microsoft, it's hosted by Microsoft, and you don't have to worry about setting it up or keeping it up. But your desktops and session hosts can run outside of Azure on Azure Stack HCI. So you deliver the same end-user experience that your users expect and love from AVD, including Windows 10 and Windows 11 Enterprise Multi-Session. But now, instead of the pixel traffic doing a round trip to the cloud, you can get lower latency and fast, snappy response times with direct access to your local session hosts using a technology we call RDP ShortPath, which is available in preview now. This is great for workloads that are performance sensitive, like video editing or computer-assisted design that you want to do using a Windows Virtual Desktop. I'm really excited about AVD on Azure Stack HCI. I can't wait for you to try this out. Now, switching gears a little, we've talked about virtualized servers, we've talked about virtualized desktops. Let's talk about app development, and specifically cloud-native application development. Last year at Microsoft Ignite, we announced the public preview of the Azure Kubernetes service on Azure Stack HCI. AKS is the fastest growing service in Azure Compute. And one of the things customers love about it is simply the pace of innovation. With AKS, we are continuously supporting the latest Kubernetes versions, continuously delivering management functionality, and continuously responding to your feedback. Now with AKS on Azure Stack HCI, you can actually run the entire control plane for AKS on your own premises on your HCI cluster, and you get the same convenient push-button experience that you love in Azure for deploying a new Kubernetes cluster. And with Arc-enabled Kubernetes, you can connect your on-premises Kubernetes cluster up to Azure to take advantage of integrations like GitOps for continuous integration and continuous deployment. Now, since our preview this time last year, the team has been hard at work. We recently reached general availability with the AKS service on Azure Stack HCI in May of this year. And since then, like clockwork, we've been delivering regular monthly updates June, July, August, and most recently September and October with new features, new fixes, new enhancements, and new functionality based on your feedback. This is the kind of continuous innovation that you expect from the Azure Kubernetes service, and now you can get it wherever it makes the most sense for you, whether that's in the Azure cloud or on your premises with Azure Stack HCI. It's important to understand that AKS is actually not just something that you can use as an administrator to manage your own containerized applications. It's also a critical infrastructure that enables you to run many other Arc-enabled Azure Platform Services, or PaaS services, on Azure Stack HCI. PaaS services that are available now include SQL Managed Instances, PostgreSQL Hyperscale, Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Azure Logic Apps, and Azure API Management. Now, if you're not familiar with some of these, don't worry. Neither was I. If you had asked me a few years ago, the only service that I had actually used myself from this list was App Services, which I've used to build a few websites. But now, with these services coming to on-premises through Azure Arc and Azure Stack HCI, it's a great time to start learning how you can take advantage of these powerful capabilities, both in the cloud and on your own terms. The team has put together a phenomenal set of tutorials and demos and more called Azure Arc Jumpstart, which you can find at aka.ms/Azure Arc Jumpstart. I highly encourage you to take some time and explore how you can leverage these PaaS services that are becoming available anywhere, including on Azure Stack HCI. Whatever Azure workload you need, whether it's servers or desktops or containers or serverless, chances are that you can run it on your terms on your premises with Azure Stack HCI. And you can get the same benefits that you enjoy with those workloads when you run them in the Azure cloud. For Windows Server, the Azure Edition is coming soon. You get free extended security updates for older versions, and you have a convenient option to pay as you go, just like you do in Azure. With the Azure Kubernetes service, you can deploy and manage Windows and Linux containers with a push-button experience, just like in the cloud. With PaaS services that are Arc-enabled, you can benefit from managed SQL, app services, functions, logic apps, and more on Azure Stack HCI. And of course, the preview that everyone's excited about today, with Azure Virtual Desktop, you can get a cloud-hosted control plane for VDI and run Windows 10 or Windows 11 Enterprise Multi-Session on Azure Stack HCI. And if you need something that's not in the list, please let us know. The team and I would love to hear your feedback as we work to make Azure Stack HCI better for you over the coming months and years. Now, we've talked about workloads and benefits, but another powerful part of the Azure cloud is the management and governance tools that are available to you across all your workloads and all your resource types. No matter what you're managing, as an administrator, you can learn and standardize on the Azure Resource Manager, the Azure Portal, the Azure Identity Access Management System, and more to manage the future of your hybrid infrastructure. That's why it's so important that Azure Stack HCI participates in the Azure Resource Manager in ARM as a first-class Azure resource. You can go to the Azure portal or use other management tools like the CLI, SDK, heck, even the Azure mobile app to see your Azure Stack HCI cluster alongside all the other resources that you have in Azure. In fact, you can tag your HCI cluster. Tags are just free-form key-value pairs. And then from anywhere, literally on your phone in the Azure mobile app, you can search across all the resources, the VMs, the databases, and the HCI clusters that you have, no matter what environment, no matter what region they're in, right from the Azure mobile app. You can also benefit from role-based access control that leverages Azure's Identity Access Management System. Access to any command that you can do through Azure's control plane flows through Azure's role-based access control system, and that's true for Azure Stack HCI as well. And you can enforce the standards and compliance requirements that are important to your organization using Azure Policy. And my favorite benefit of this Azure management, and the one that I want to dive into a little more right now, is management extensions. Because of how Azure Stack HCI integrates with Azure, you can easily install powerful management extensions. Extensions are small pieces of functionality that aren't present by default, but that you can easily add with a single click in the Azure portal. And we're in the process of enlightening many extensions to integrate specifically with Azure Stack HCI clusters. Now, from the Azure portal, from the resource page for your HCI cluster, you can easily do lifecycle management for an extension. You can add, modify, update, or remove it with just a single click. This means you can stay in the portal. There's no need to go outside and copy files or run an installer just to get some agent tree set up. It's also cluster aware, so with a single click it will apply to all the nodes in your cluster. And that intent is persisted. So if you add a node or replace a node down the road, it will get the same extensions as all the other nodes because your intent is stored in the Azure cloud that this cluster should have this extension. I want to take a moment to explain how this works because it's pretty cool. Behind the scenes, every Azure Stack HCI node, beginning with version 21H2, is an Azure Arc enabled server. This is what enables this robust mechanism to add, modify, and remove capabilities. You, as a user in the Azure portal, interact with your Arc enabled HCI cluster resource. But behind the scenes, when you say, hey, this cluster should have this extension, that call is forwarded to each of the Arc-enabled nodes that is managed by the cluster, sitting in a managed resource group. And the next time that the Azure Arc agent, which is pre-installed on every HCI node when you register, the next time that it connects to the cloud to sync what extensions it should have, it'll discover, oh, hey, I'm supposed to have a particular extension, such as Log Analytics, and then download that extension onto each of the nodes and complete the installation completely unattended. So there's nothing that you as a user need to do. You can just click one button in the Azure portal and all of your nodes will get the extension. It's very cool. Let me give you an example of a scenario that really benefits from this capability. This is something that you, our customers, tell us about all the time. Hyperconverged infrastructure, because of how it collapses compute and storage into a smaller footprint, is ideal for deployments at edge locations like on the manufacturing floor or in retail stores or branch offices. The challenge, of course, is that in each of these locations, there are no IT personnel, or there's very limited access for IT personnel. So how can a central IT team sitting somewhere else remotely manage a large fleet of deployments of HCI clusters that may be distributed around the world? This is a problem to which we've not had a great answer until now. That's why earlier this year, powered by Azure Arc, we introduced a new scenario called multi-cluster monitoring in the Azure portal that leverages a capability called Azure Monitor Insights for Azure Stack HCI. This is available in preview today. The great thing about our Insights capability is that it's built on Azure Arc and built on an extension. So it's an Azure native solution. There's nothing that you, the customer or an integrator, need to worry about integrating. There's no database, there's no third-party software, there's nothing that you need to obtain, install, and then manage. It's also designed to be highly scalable. So it scales to hundreds of clusters, and it's completely independent of their physical location or what on-premises domain they're in. It's even independent of what subscription they're registered with. You can monitor all of your clusters in a single pane of glass using Azure Monitor Insights. And perhaps most exciting, at least for me, is that it's customizable. So what we've launched today is a minimal initial release to sort of prove out what's possible, but all of the visualizations, all of the underlying queries even, are completely customizable either by the end customer or by a solution vendor or integrator, so that you can extend it to visualize and monitor even more things about your HCI cluster right there in the portal. Here's a screenshot that gives you just a quick sneak peek at how this looks. You'll see that when you navigate to Azure Monitor, on the left-hand side, in the list of resource types that Azure Monitor can monitor for you, you'll now find Azure Stack HCI. And when you click in there, you can see all of your clusters in a single pane of glass right out of the box. There's no need to do any kind of complicated configuration or setup. It's just right there in Azure Monitor. So how does this work? Let's peel back the covers a little bit and understand what's going on here. On every node in your Azure Stack HCI cluster, Azure Arc will install a monitoring agent called the Microsoft Monitoring Agent. This is an extension that you can install with just one click, as I showed earlier. Once installed, the MMA collects logs from the health service. Yes, that same health service that we've been using for years to monitor Azure Stack HCI, and it will upload logs from the health service into a log analytics workspace in the customer's own subscription. From there, What our team has done is provide an insight solution, which is really an Azure Monitor workbook template that contains queries and visualizations so that you can extract insights from the underlying logs that are being uploaded. And then last, we've connected that into the resource page for the Azure Stack HCI cluster in the portal, so that when you as a user navigate to your cluster in the portal, you see a set of charts and visualizations that are really being provided by the workbook template based on the logs that are coming from the health service on-prem. What's cool about this, apart from the fact that it's all extensible by you, is that it uses the same underlying sources of data as you would see in, for example, Windows Admin Center or in System Center Operations Manager for an HCI cluster, meaning you get a consistent view no matter which of these panes of glass you choose to look at depending on your scenario. And that's just one example of the kinds of powerful extra management functionality that can be added to an Azure Stack HCI cluster using an extension. Here you can see the roadmap of all the extensions we have planned that we're bringing from Azure to Azure Stack HCI. I talked about monitoring, specifically leveraging the MMA extension so that you can send logs and metrics from the OS up into Azure Monitor. But we're also working on extensions for Windows Admin Center in the Azure portal, for guest configuration in Azure Auto Manage, for bringing the Hyper-V to Azure agent for Azure Site Recovery as an extension to Azure Stack HCI, and for the new and improved Run Command v2, which is the successor to Custom Script, which is one of the most popular extensions in Azure today. And you can bet there will be more as we continue to make it easier than ever to manage your Azure Stack HCI cluster from the Azure portal. Now we'll talk a lot more about each of these in the coming months, which is good because today I don't have the time to dive into each of them in detail. But I hope that gives you a clear sense of what we're doing with Azure Arc and extensions for managing your HCI cluster. Let's switch gears now. So far we've talked all about managing your infrastructure, your host cluster itself, and the servers that are part of it. But today, at Microsoft Ignite, we're announcing the biggest expansion of Azure Arc since it was first introduced 2 years ago. You can now provision and manage virtual machines that are running on your Azure Stack HCI cluster directly from the Azure portal. This experience is rolling out now, so you'll see it soon in the Azure portal. On the left-hand side, when you navigate to an HCI cluster resource, you will see sub-resources of that cluster also projected into the Azure control plane, into ARM, including, importantly, the virtual machines and then their sub-objects like disks that are running on your HCI cluster. With this new capability delivered through Azure Arc, you get a consistent user experience across the cloud and the edge for provisioning and managing virtual machines. In the Azure portal, the VMs that are running on your HCI cluster look just like the VMs that you're running in the Azure cloud. You can also use ARM templates now to automate VM deployments onto your Azure Stack HCI, just like you would in Azure. And you can control which users in your Azure Active Directory have access to which VMs on Azure Stack HCI. This enables a self-service scenario where a user can provision a VM for themselves, but they're not able to access other users' VMs or the underlying fabric. This has been one of the most requested scenarios for years, and I'm so excited that now, this year at Ignite, you can try it out for yourself. And coming very soon, we're also going to automatically Arc enable these guest VMs. That's not there right now, but it will be available in preview shortly, and this will allow you to easily manage and monitor the guest OS and the apps without any kind of additional setup. Here's a screenshot that shows you how it looks to create a virtual machine through Azure Arc onto your Azure Stack HCI cluster. You'll see it looks very, very familiar with just a few small differences that are specific to on-prem, such as choosing the custom location. In other words, choosing the HCI cluster that you want to deploy to. Now that's an important hint. You can of course connect many HCI clusters into Azure's control plane, and then easily from the same pane of glass provision a VM onto any of them right from here. And last, but certainly not least, on the topic of Azure management, I'm also delighted to share that both Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery now officially support Azure Stack HCI, including the new version 21H2. If you've been following closely, previously these scenarios were not supported with HCI, but now with the v3 UR2 of the Microsoft Azure Backup Service, you can back up Azure Stack HCI, the host, including system state, and the VMs running on your HCI cluster. And with Azure Site Recovery, you can replicate continuously for VMs running on HCI up into the cloud, and then fail them over and even fail them back onto Azure Stack HCI. Both of these scenarios are officially supported as of today. So that's a quick look at some of the ways that you can take advantage of Azure's powerful management capabilities on your own infrastructure with Azure Stack HCI. And finally, Azure Stack HCI is edge infrastructure, so we need to talk about infrastructure. Now you might not know this, but within Microsoft, the same team that builds Azure Stack HCI is directly responsible for building and rolling out the operating system that we run in our own Azure data centers. So when Microsoft's engineers or operations folks request a new feature or they need something changed, that request comes to us. And now we can take that innovation and not only put it into Azure, but we can also deliver it to you for use on your terms, on your premises with Azure Stack HCI. That's exactly what we've done this year with the 21H2 feature update, also known as Azure Stack HCI version 21H2, which is our newest OS feature release this fall. This release is packed with new infrastructure functionality and enhancements that I think you're going to love. First, KernelSoft Reboot, a technology that allows you to restart your server up to 10 times faster by bypassing the entire power on self-test and pre-boot sequence. We've also added support for GPUs, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. We have a new dynamic CPU compatibility feature. This is one of the most requested features from customers who use Hyper-V today. You can now mix and match processor generations in the same cluster, which is important if you need to scale out later, with minimum performance degradation. The cluster intelligently figures out what common subset of processor instructions are available and offers all of them to the VM, so there's very, very little degradation. We also now support thin provisioning for storage spaces direct, which means you can size and allocate data volumes independent of how much physical capacity you actually have present. This greatly simplifies capacity management and planning. It means you don't need to worry so much about volume sizes anymore. With Network ATC, you can now do intent-based configuration for your host networking in the cluster, including IP addresses, VLANs, virtual switch embedded teaming, and more. Your configuration propagates cluster-wide and automatically corrects for drift later if something changes. And of course, something we've talked about a lot is secured core server. This provides you a baseline assurance for hardware, firmware, and OS hardening against both current and future threats, so you can have peace of mind knowing that your infrastructure, which is the foundation for everything else, is secure. Now, in the interest of time, I'm only going to dive into one of these in more detail, and since we've talked so much already this year about KernelSoft Reboot, I'd like to focus instead on what we're doing with GPUs. Now, GPU workloads are on the rise. We see this in Azure, and we also hear it from you, our customers. And that's why the 21H2 feature update has some big changes for GPUs. You can now provide high availability to GPU workloads with GPU pools, a new technology that's available in Azure Stack HCI version 21H2. The way this technology works is ideal for machine learning workloads because you can deliver whole GPU acceleration to the most demanding workloads. Now, previously we called this DDA, or discrete device assignment, but as you'll see, there are some pretty big differences now to what you can do when assigning these GPUs to machine learning workloads. First of all, failover clustering can now actually manage those GPUs as resources and manage placement for GPU-demanding workloads across the cluster. This means there's automatic failover, so after a host in your cluster fails, a VM with a GPU assignment can automatically start on another node where it will receive a GPU from that node. And all of this is easy to set up because it integrates with PowerShell and with Windows Admin Center, the tools you're already using to manage your VMs on Azure Stack HCI. To go a little deeper, let me show you how this works. In this example, we have a cluster where each of the servers has 2 NVIDIA GPUs. Rather than assigning a GPU directly to a virtual machine, I'm instead going to place all of those GPUs into a new PCI Express resource pool, which I'll give the same name on each of the servers. Then, instead of assigning the VM to a GPU, I'll assign that VM to the pool of GPUs. And you probably see where this is going. This means that if the VM needs to fail over from host 1 to host 2, let's say host 1 has a failure, when it arrives on host 2, it will be assigned a new GPU from the same pool, so that that workload, as soon as the VM starts back up after failover, has the same acceleration that it enjoyed before the failure. This gives you high availability for your workloads even when they have GPUs attached. Whew, okay. This has been a quick look at everything that's new for Azure Stack HCI in 2021 across every dimension that makes Azure a great platform for you and your business. Whether it's the workloads you love, like Azure Virtual Desktop, or the management tooling that you want to standardize on, like ARM and extensions, or innovation in the core infrastructure stack, like high availability for GPUs, there is something here that will make every Azure Stack HCI deployment better. And that's the nature of our Edge Infrastructure Service. This year, next year, and every year, you can look forward to more exciting announcements for Azure Stack HCI. I'm thrilled to say that Azure Stack HCI version 21H2 is ready and available right now, and it's supported for production use. And based on our testing, it is the most solid and stable version we have ever shipped. For new deployments, you can browse solutions that come with version 21H2 pre-installed in the completely redesigned solutions website at azure.com/HCI. The solutions catalog now has new filters so that you can find solutions with GPUs, find solutions that are sold through an as a service model, and more. You'll also find an all-new Sizer tool, which is available in preview on that website. And last, of course, you can also download Azure Stack HCI version 21H2 directly from azure.com/HCI so that you can install it on hardware that you already have. What's more and what's new, all existing deployments of Azure Stack HCI can receive version 21H2 as a free over-the-air feature update. That's available to all subscribers right now. Simply use your favorite management tools like Windows Admin Center or the command line with sconfig to scan for updates on your cluster and apply them. You should check with your hardware vendor if they have any specific guidance, and this is important, if you use System Center Virtual Machine Manager, make sure you have the latest version of that first. On behalf of the whole Azure Stack HCI team in Redmond, thank you for attending Microsoft Ignite, and thank you so much for watching this session. We can't wait to see what you'll do with Azure Stack HCI. Take care, and I hope to see you next time.